Hello, welcome to July First Time Film Watches 2023. And I'm going to try to make this quick because I'm a little pressed for time. So we're just going to jump into the movies that I watched. The first film I'm going to go over is The Breakfast Club. It is directed by John Hughes and came out in the 80s, I believe, and has Molly Ringwald, Emilio Estevez, a few other actors who I know are well known, but I can't remember their names off the top of my head. And this is one of those films that is considered sort of like a cult classic. It's one of those movies where if I tell people I haven't seen this film before, they look at me and they go, "You haven't seen The Breakfast Club? You're in the movies and you haven't seen The Breakfast Club?" It's just, no, I haven't. I can't watch every single fucking movie. Anyway, I finally watched it. It was on Netflix, so I decided to check it out, and I think I watched it with Megan, and it's good. I like it. It's one of those films where I can easily see why people would say it's their favorite movie or why they would tell me they love it so much, because it's one of those where it's very dialogue heavy. The filmmaking isn't necessarily the goal or the most important thing that's going on in the film. What's most important is the characters and the dialogue that they have with each other, and the main lesson of it being that you really shouldn't judge a book by its cover, and there's usually more to a person than just what appears on the outside, and you never really know somebody or can make any judgments about anyone until you get to have a conversation with them. I do like a lot of the scenes in this film. I think that the dialogue and the acting between the actors and the things that the characters say to each other are pretty compelling. I quite like the sort of like burnout bully character, essentially. The one who's like manic the entire time. I do like his dynamic and how much it sort of carries the overall story forward, and I use air quotes for story because there really isn't much of a story to this movie. It's literally just the characters talking to each other and learning about their lives and their differences and maybe even their similarities. What I think sometimes this film does that I'm not a huge fan of is sometimes the dialogue scenes, especially when it has all five of the main characters talking to each other. When it does that sort of thing, it is compelling and it is fun to see. And the dialogue is well written for the most part, but sometimes it feels like it kind of circles in on itself a little too much, where the characters, there's a scene going on and they're discussing something, and it's a bit more of an emotional scene that's going on. And what you're supposed to gauge from it is pretty much already said within the first few lines, but then they sort of linger on it a little too long, and it kind of just keeps going in a circle. Like the dialogue just doesn't feel like it's going to resolve anywhere sometimes. And then it finally does, and that's good, and I like the way it wraps it up, but sometimes it just takes so long to get to that place. And I think the goal of what John Hughes wanted to do with those scenes is he wanted to linger on it and make it feel more believable and true to life, which, you know, I get it and I recognize it. But when it comes to creating a movie where the emphasis is just the dialogue, I really do think that you could possibly take some creative liberties when it comes to human beings having a conversation with each other. Because in real life, conversations aren't always, you know, based on cinematic choices or narrative. Like it's the most organic thing you can have is a conversation with another human being. And conversations are messy. They're not perfect. There's all sorts of different beats that people can miss, and people misspeak, and it's a whole different ballpark than compared to movie dialogue. That being said, I think that movie dialogue doesn't necessarily have to be 100% realistic in that sense. It can be a little more cinematic. It can be more interesting. Take a Tarantino movie, for example. The dialogue that he creates in those films are compelling, and it's fun because you're watching these very strong personality characters talking to each other in a certain way, and they're delivering dialogue that feels like it has a punch. I wouldn't say those conversations are realistic in any way, but it's compelling. Same goes for Mass, another movie where the goal of that film is to have a dialogue between 4 different people. Granted, the subject matter in Mass is a little bit heavier than what these characters are talking about, but it is interesting to note that the characters feel like they could be real people while the dialogue isn't necessarily sacrificed for the sake of it being realistic. It is cinematic, it is dramatic, and it is compelling to see and carries the story forward between those characters. With this one, you do get a lot of that, but there's some times in between where it just feels like it's a little too, I don't know, circling it on itself, for lack of a better word. Also, I mean, visually, this film is not anything special, really. It's not meant to be. It's one of those things where the cinematography isn't the goal of the film. Like, you're not meant to look at it and go, oh, wow, the visuals are really cool. But it would have been nice if we had something a little more compelling than just the standard stuff, you know? But yeah, with Breakfast Club, I enjoyed it overall. It's one of those where I can see myself revisiting it and maybe even possibly changing my score on it, but right now it sits at a 7 out of 10. Next up is The Wolf of Wall Street, directed by Martin Scorsese and stars Leonardo DiCaprio, Jonah Hill, Matthew McConaughey pops up for like a hot second, and it's one of those films where Martin Scorsese is well known for having directed, and if people think of Martin Scorsese, sometimes they think of Wolf of Wall Street, and I really did enjoy this movie. I thought that the runtime, first and foremost, was really great despite it being 3 hours. I thought that the pacing was not an issue for a movie that's that long. You know, I've watched movies that are 90 minutes that feel longer than The Wolf of Wall Street, and I think that's a testament to how good this movie is and how well paced it is. I also think that the acting's brilliant. Leonardo DiCaprio and Jonah Hill, they knock it out of the park, and I think that Leo is known as one of the better actors of this modern day for a reason. He can pull all sorts of different characters off like it's nothing, you know? And I think that the runtime is also justified because this movie feels very grand, it feels very purposeful most of the time, and I think that when it comes to seeing the sort of rise and fall of a character, you sort of need that time with this specific movie in order to build it up and justify everything. And it doesn't really feel like any scene is particularly wasted when it comes to this runtime. Like, I don't think there's really much you could cut out of this that would make the movie even tighter than it already is. And I think that when it comes to a lot of his filmography, Martin Scorsese is just a great director when it comes to that. One thing that I wasn't a huge fan of with this film is that sometimes there would be scenes where it felt very much like there wasn't a script involved, or that there wasn't any sort of written lines that the characters had to go off of. A lot of the time, I shouldn't say a lot of the time because it was very few and far between, but there's 2 different scenes that I'm thinking of where it felt like there wasn't a script and Martin Scorsese just went up to the actors and said, all right, this is the situation of the scene, this is where your characters are now, this is where your characters need to be by the end of the scene, and go. And it felt like a lot of it was improvised and off the cuff, and that they just sort of wung it for those scenes. And while that can be compelling to see, if it goes on for a little too long, it can sort of take me out of the film. And for a movie where not much of the runtime feels like that, it's very distracting to me. And I wasn't a huge fan of those choices when it came to filming those particular scenes. Still, though, this movie was pretty great. I could see myself watching it again, but I would need to give it more time just because it is so long and because it's one of those films where it's very heavy. Not in terms of like really subject matter or anything, but just in terms of like the overall story and the weight of it and how much is happening in the film. Like, and I don't mean there's a whole lot of weight within the context of the story. It's not like super dark or anything, but it's one of those where there's a lot happening and it can be almost overstimulating at times, and I would need to give it some time in order to watch this movie again. But I really liked it, so Wolf of Wall Street gets an 8 out of 10 from me. Next up is 65, directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods. It is an Adam Driver dinosaur movie, and it fucking sucks. So let me get a positive out of the way. I like Adam Driver. I think he's a good actor. And I think that he's not necessarily phoning it in with this movie. I think that there is a part of him that is giving himself to this project and therefore is more of a compelling part of it. That being said, they don't really do much in terms of a performance because the whole time he's just kind of running and trying to escape dinosaurs, and he's got like this daughter character. It's not like his daughter, but like it's like a little girl figure that he's like trying to keep safe and to get back home and all this stuff. And there's a lot that I've forgotten about this film, honestly, because of just how not special it is and just unmemorable the entire movie is from start to finish. So let me try my best to sort of reel it back and figure out what exactly was wrong with this film. First of all, it's very predictable. You can tell immediately where things are headed because it's a very simple plot. It's not like super unnecessarily convoluted or anything. It's very straightforward. It's basically a point A to point B survival story. The things that happen as far as character dynamics and character tension and where these relationships are, and there's only really two characters in this whole movie, it's super predictable. And the writing for their characters isn't anything compelling or special. It's like they wrote one of the most bland screenplays they could possibly write for a movie with a premise like this, despite the fact that it has stupid dinosaur stuff happening and that the story is very simplistic. I feel like, okay, maybe it could have been elevated by the dialogue, maybe it could have been elevated by the acting or the different sort of situations they're finding themselves in, but this movie doesn't do that at all. It's just very straightforward, very bland, very unspecial when it comes to this movie as a whole. The special effects were fine, I guess. They were okay in some points. They were definitely not okay in other points. It doesn't really feel like there's any tension with this. The way it's filmed, it's very standard. If you told me that this was like a prequel or an offshoot to the Jurassic World movies, then I would believe you 100%, because it definitely feels like a crappy spin-off of an already crappy movie franchise. I'm not going to talk about this one anymore. This movie sucks. 3 out of 10. We're done with it. Speaking of movies that suck, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, directed by James Mangold. So I'm not really familiar with a James Mangold movie. I have yet to see Logan, even though I've heard that that's a really good take on the superhero movie genre and that it's a compelling story in of itself. Watching this movie, it just felt like somebody trying to copy Steven Spielberg and what he's done with the Indiana Jones franchise. So, first of all, a lot of people are saying that this movie does a really good job with the de-aging and the visual effects of Harrison Ford and his face, trying to get him to look younger. And I agree with it a little bit. I think that for the most part, it looks pretty distracting, and it's really off-putting seeing young Indiana Jones's face moving around on this person's body. It's probably a body double that they used, and that they didn't actually use Harrison Ford's real body in those scenes. If they did, I would be maybe impressed, but what's so off-putting about it is you're looking at this young Indiana Jones, and you're hearing old Harrison Ford coming out of that face, and it just takes me out of the scene so many times. And the beginning of the movie, this isn't really a spoiler, but the first 15 to 20 minutes, you're spending time with young Indy, and it's really jarring and super distracting. I could not move past that. There's another scene in this movie where it takes place later on, where Indiana Jones is a little bit older, but he's not quite as old as current day Indiana Jones. I say current day, but it takes place in the 60s and 70s, I think. I feel like that de-aging worked a lot better, and it was still a little bit noticeable, but it was a lot more appropriately used than the scene where he's jumping on trains and trying to fight bad guys with his young face on him. And those animations, and you could tell they were animations. You could tell it wasn't actually someone jumping on a train. It just looked terrible. I'm sorry. I wasn't a fan of it at all, really. Until they got to that scene later on in the movie. I just couldn't believe the de-aging. I thought it was pretty poorly done. I also really didn't like the writing of this film. This definitely feels like the sort of same tier as Kingdom of the Crystal Skull to me in terms of the character writing and the character likability. I wasn't a huge fan of Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character at all. I do like her acting. I think that her performance isn't the issue. I just think that her character writing doesn't really leave us with any room to sort of sympathize with her and to agree with her choices of what she's doing in this movie. Like, to me, it felt like they wanted to make this sort of subversive of expectations character where, oh, at first you think, oh, she's gonna be like the Shia LaBeouf of this movie, like she's gonna be sort of following Indy and helping Indy along the way, but it turns out, oh nope, she's subversive, she's manipulative, she's kind of a thief, she has some dark tendencies and betrays a lot of people throughout the film, and it felt like they wanted to sort of subvert those expectations because we're so used to how things were in previous films of like, oh, Indy has a sidekick who's always helping him, whereas this one, it's a little more cheeky than that. And it felt like they tried to make the character sort of fun and exciting when really it just sort of came across as annoying and really didn't do any favors for the character or the writing when it came to this particular part of the movie. I will say her character was more likable than the kid that they stuck her with. Like, her sort of sidekick kid character, like, the acting I thought was terrible. I thought his writing was bad. Like, he was super fucking annoying, and I just wish he wasn't there the entire movie. Like, I shouldn't say entire movie because he doesn't show up until like halfway through probably, but I really didn't care for him at all. I could have used this entire movie without him. Like, the movie would have been better without him there, honestly. Like, I got so sick of him after a while. I feel like the concept of Mads Mikkelsen's villain character could be fun, and I do love how he plays him, but the writing for his character is just sort of like stoic bad guy, and they don't really let Mads Mikkelsen play around with it. They don't let him sort of stretch in the role and do what he needs to do in order for the villain to be compelling. Like, he's just some guy. Like, he's just some Nazi dude. And you could literally have anybody play that character and have anybody perform in that role, and it wouldn't be any different, really. Like, I feel like they totally waste Mads Mikkelsen's time in this movie, and I'm offended for him. I hated the ending of this. I really didn't like how there was such this interesting build-up with, like, the different things going on, and don't worry, I'm not going to spoil it, but I feel like where they were headed with it was appropriate for Indy's character and would have been a nice way to sort of cap off the franchise, despite the fact that this is 2 movies too much, in my opinion. But it would have been a nice way to sort of have a good send-off and to wrap things up symbolically for his character. But nope, they decide to not do that, and they just kind of return to where we were at the beginning of the film. And that creative decision rubbed me the wrong way so much. Some of the visuals were cool, and I will say I like Harrison Ford. I think that he's good at playing this character, and you can tell that he actually gives a shit about playing Indiana Jones, and I think that watching him is compelling in its own, but everything else about this just feels very middling, very mediocre at best. And I even forgot that Antonio Banderas was in the movie. Like, they just throw him in and then he's gone like that, and it's so unspecial. Like, you'd think that getting an actor like that to play that character would have more weight to it, but nope, fuck that. We're just gonna do away with it. Fuck you, audience. Fuck you who came to see an Indiana Jones movie to be compelled and to be entertained. Hope you go suck a dick. Indiana Jones, Dial of Destiny, 4 out of 10. We're moving on. I'm not going to talk about these next 2 films for very long because we covered them on the podcast, and frankly, neither of them are very good. So the first one we're going to touch on is Mission to Mars, directed by Brian De Palma. This one I like a lot more than the next movie I'm going to talk about because, and I still don't think that this is a good movie. I don't think that this is anything really worth seeing, but just for the sake of entertainment, I do think that this movie overall is better than Red Planet. And Mission to Mars, it handles things in a sort of very goofy, off the cuff, almost unpredictable way. And you can tell that there's some elements of this film where they sort of took a lot of inspiration from 2001: A Space Odyssey, like the way the ship's designed and the way the sets are built, and especially the ending of the film where the characters end up is very reminiscent of 2001, and it feels like this movie took a lot of notes from that in order to try and make a compelling movie. But that combined with the rest of the tone of the film is just so goofy to me, and how it all unfolds is really too wacky for my liking for this specific type of movie. Like, you can go wacky, you can go however you want with a sci-fi film, but when you try to do it in a way where the tones of the film just go like this, it just comes across so cheesy to me. There's some scenes in this that to me are so laughably bad that I have to give this points over Red Planet just because of how entertainingly stupid this film is. Not going to talk about it much longer. If you want to see what I'm talking about, I guess watch it for yourself, but maybe get some friends, watch it because it's so bad that it's good. And this one I'm giving a 4 out of 10. Maybe it's a little too high, but I do like some of the acting. Some of it's very stilted, and obviously some of the actors look like they just don't want to be there, but I don't know, I had a little bit of fun with it, so take that how you will. Next up is Red Planet. I alluded to this in the last movie I talked about. This is directed by Anthony Hoffman, and this is not nearly as entertainingly bad as Mission to Mars. To me, this one is just very kind of straightforwardly bland. Like, it sort of becomes a survival mission for Val Kilmer and Tom Sizemore, and Carrie-Anne Moss is on the ship and she's trying to help them remotely, and it's very forgettable, kind of boring, very predictable, and it's one of those films where it just is so forgettable that you can't help but just take points off of it just because of how unspecial it is. So one of my biggest problems with this movie is the way they handle Carrie-Anne Moss's character. So within the plot, she is the highest ranking astronaut on the ship. Like, she's the one who is control of everything. She flies the ship, and she outranks all the other men that are on there. And I think there's like 5 other dudes. And when they go down to the planet, Carrie-Anne Moss, her character is the only one who is forced to stay on the ship. And I feel like they made that decision because, to me, it felt like they just wanted to have an excuse for Carrie-Anne Moss to stay on the ship and stay in like a tank top or like these more revealing articles of clothing where the camera can just look at her and go like, oh, look, boobies. This will get our male audience to glue their eyes to the screen, and it just felt so cheesy and transparent to me. Like, it's in such bad taste. Like, it's so obvious what you're doing with this movie. Like, I mean, I guess props to them for not having shame, but man, they really should have. Also, you could tell that Val Kilmer just didn't want to be in this movie. Like, he just didn't give a shit. Tom Sizemore, I kind of liked his character a little bit, and like the way that he was playing that character I thought was kind of interesting, but they don't really go much anywhere with it. And then there's another astronaut who they're supposed to kind of be like the villain character of the film, but the way they build up to it, it just feels so forced, and it's almost like the movie's telling you, all right, this guy's the bad guy now. Like, we didn't do this in a natural way. We didn't build his character up or anything to be a villain properly. We're just kind of telling you that he is, and you're supposed to take it that way. And you're just left sitting there going like, okay, sure. Why the fuck not? Yeah, this movie kind of sucks hard. This is a 2 out of 10 for me. If you're curious about our full thoughts, go listen to the podcast episode. We talk about both Mission to Mars and Red Planet. Bunch of bullshit. 7, directed by David Fincher. It stars Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman, and that's pretty much all I'll say about the cast of it, because definitely check this movie out without reading up anything about it first. And I'm actually going to advise you to watch this movie before you listen to me talk about it. So if you haven't seen it, watch it, come back to this video, and then you'll get sort of a more proper insight into my thoughts. And I'm not really going to spoil anything with this anyway, but it's one of those few movies that I suggest you go into it not knowing anything about it, and you'll be better off for it. I thought this was really great, really compelling David Fincher movie. It's aged beautifully. This is a movie that came out before Fight Club, before he directed The Game, and I think that the way it's shot and the technical elements of it and the music is very timeless. Like, this is a movie that you could have told me came out in 2007 and I would believe you, because I think that it is so well made technically, and also very well made on a story level, on a character level. I think that it's very well written, and you can tell where David Fincher's sort of love of crime thrillers comes from, because this is sort of one of the first ones that he did in order to establish himself as a well-known director. And I think that as far as a thriller crime movie goes, I don't know if you can get much better than something that David Fincher creates with not only this movie but other movies that he's directed. And you can really tell that he has a love for this type of genre. I thought that Brad Pitt was great. I really do love the framing of the characters in this movie, where you're pretty much mostly following Morgan Freeman, and Brad Pitt kind of like comes and goes, and he's definitely like another big part of the movie. But really watching this movie with the context of Morgan Freeman's character being the main person you're following helps quite a bit when it comes to viewing this movie overall, and especially thinking about it after everything unfolds. And that's really compelling and cool to see. One thing that I wasn't a huge fan of with this film is the editing, especially towards the end of the movie. The way that the climactic moment happens is compelling in itself, but the way that it cuts around the different characters and is sort of showing you the different angles of what's going on and how it's unfolding, to me it kind of falls apart. And I know that that is one of the best parts of the film to a lot of people, but to me it almost feels like one of the worst parts of it, because it builds up to this thing, and the way it's so choppily cut together, it almost doesn't feel like a David Fincher movie at that point, with the camera angles and the cuts and the different sort of editing choices going on. Like, it just feels very out of place to me, and it sort of almost killed the momentum of what was being built up before. That being said, I do really like how it ended. It is an iconic ending, and I can't deny how it unfolds is very compelling. It's just that moment in particular wasn't a huge positive for me. And maybe if I watch it again, I'll have a different mindset and I'll see it in a better light. But when I watched this the first time, I was just like, oh, okay, that was weird. I wasn't a huge fan of it, but overall this movie is great. And for me, this is an 8 out of 10. It might go up if I watch it again, but for right now, very solid David Fincher movie. And I'm going through all of his filmography before The Killer comes out, because I'm quite excited for that. It looks sort of a similar ilk to a lot of what he's made and a lot of what I like from him. Next up is Barbie, directed by Greta Gerwig, Margot Robbie, Ryan Gosling. Let's go. First of all, this is one of the funniest movies I think I've seen in a long time, especially in a theater setting, because I think that the comedic beats and the timing of everything is just so well written. I think that Greta Gerwig and Noah Baumbach nailed the screenplay for this movie, and it felt like a lot of love went into the characters and the dialogue that they give. And especially, and I'm going to beat a dead horse when I say this, but Ryan Gosling playing Ken is one of the most iconic roles I think that I've seen in a movie this year. He is great, and his comedic timing and everything is just amazing. And his character is sort of written to be a joke in himself, but he also plays it in a way where it's super compelling and you sort of understand the perspective of it. And I really do like the way Margot Robbie plays Barbie too. I think that her comedic timing is what it needed to be. I really like the different line deliveries she has. I like the line that she has about not being a fascist, how she doesn't control the flow of commerce and everything. Like, I like the stuff that she does too. Not to sort of like jump on the Ken bandwagon, which, you know, I definitely have. unabashedly. But I also want to acknowledge that Margot Robbie does a great job too. And I think that overall, this is a movie where it's kind of funny to me how people are watching it and sort of being offended by it, calling it like a feminist film, when there's so much more going on than that in this movie. There's so many different angles, so many different viewpoints and perspectives of what you can gauge from this movie. And I think that's ultimately the point of it, is that having these different perspectives from these characters and their situations that they're in is ultimately what we're supposed to gauge from this. Like, people are reading too much into one part of it and getting angry about it when there's so many other different things going on in this movie. And I think that some people just sort of need to open their mind when it comes to a film like this. I'm talking to you, Ben Shapiro, you fucking goddamn goblin. Forgive me, I had dropped my little thingy, my little fidget thing. The production value is great. I think that overall the set design and everything going on is awesome. One thing I do want to note is, I mean, this is sort of the same sort of beef I have with The Breakfast Club, but visually and cinematography wise, this movie isn't really anything special. It's not really doing much compelling in the way of a visual style. There's some shots that look really cool, and some parts where it even almost reminded me of a Wes Anderson movie of sorts, especially when it came to like the office building that they go to later in the film. But there's not much in terms of a visual style when it comes to this movie being super compelling for me. There's also some characters that I feel like they didn't necessarily really need, like the characters they meet in the real world that kind of go back to Barbie Land. I didn't think that they were super necessary, and I do like America Ferrera's monologue that she gives, but like, you didn't really need the daughter character. You didn't really need a whole lot of what went into the real world elements of this movie. And I thought that Will Ferrell was fine. Like, he was better than I expected him to be. I thought he was going to be his dumb man-child self, and he kind of is a few times in this film, but the way that he's directed and the way he plays that character is a lot more reined in than what we get from something like Step Brothers or Talladega Nights or whatever the fuck else he plays the same damn character in. So yeah, Barbie's great movie, very funny. Yeah, I had a good time with it. Had a good time seeing this in the theaters. This is an 8 out of 10. Next up is Oppenheimer. See what I did there? Next up is directed by Christopher Nolan, and it stars Cillian Murphy and pretty much everyone in Hollywood. Yeah, it's one of those movies. This movie was fucking great, and I had a really good time seeing this in 70mm IMAX. And we're very lucky here in West Michigan because we have pretty close access to one of the 12 70mm IMAX movie theaters in the United States of America. So shout out to the Cinema Carousel in GR North. You guys are the real ones, you know. Solidarity there. But anyway, back to the movie. Oppenheimer is just pretty much overall fantastic movie, and it's one of those where the second time I watched it, it cemented my opinion of it after I watched it the first time, because the first like 30 to 45 minutes of it, it's a lot of different jumping back and forth between different time periods and different perspectives and different events of the film, and you're kind of wondering, all right, where is this going to build up to? But then it sort of all comes together like a puzzle piece, and the way it fits by the end of the film, I was just on board with 100%. I think Cillian Murphy's great. I think that he delivers an awesome performance, and I think Robert Downey Jr. really stands out in this film, and it's really great to see him in a noteworthy role post MCU, and I'm excited to see what else he is going to be in that will sort of bring those strengths out in his acting abilities. I think that the writing is pretty good for the most part. There are some scenes here and there where it almost feels a little too flowery, a little too well written, if that makes sense. And I think this is something we talked about on the podcast too when we discussed this movie. But sometimes with biopics specifically, you get a lot of character writing and just writing in general where you can tell it's going in a certain direction. You can tell that the goal of the filmmaker is reaching a point where they have to hit certain beats when it comes to making a biopic, and there's these triumphant moments, and it feels very cinematic and feels like, oh wow, I can't believe that I'm watching something that actually unfolded. And of course there's creative liberties taken. Of course there are moments that are exaggerated because Chris Nolan is making this into a compelling movie, and it is compelling, and I do like the way it's written, but sometimes it's a little too transparent when it comes to those certain things. But I'm not going to take too many points off of it because it does make the story a lot more engaging that way. Cinematography is great. I really like the editing, the choice of using certain music versus not using music, and the Trinity scene I think is one of the best scenes in the movie, on top of a scene that happens almost immediately after is when he's in an assembly hall, and there's a lot of chanting and a lot of really cool sound design and effects going on in this film. Like this movie is like a technical marvel. Like, I just love the way that it is technically put together, and for the most part how it's put together on a story level. Acting's overall really great, like I said, and I'd be really curious what I think about this movie if I watch it again for a third time, because really watching this for a second time cemented my opinion of it the first time around. And this movie, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. We discussed it on the podcast, so check that out if you want. This movie's a 9 out of 10. Last, but certainly not least, because it's part 1 of a movie, is Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning Part 1. Directed by Christopher McQuarrie, stars Tom Cruise, the man, the myth, the Xenu legend, you know. Hail Xenu. This movie, it's one of those films where it's kind of hard to judge it on its own because it's a part 1 of a part 2, and a lot of the different characters that we meet for the first time in this film we're going to see again, and we're going to encounter them, and it's going to continue the story, and hopefully it wraps it up in a compelling way. But for right now, we kind of have to deal with what we're given, and that is Dead Reckoning Part 1. So let's jump into it. This movie, I think, is sort of a step down from what we've gotten before with Fallout and with Rogue Nation, and even Ghost Protocol to some extent. One that I thought was pretty good overall, but not nearly as good as 5 and 6. This movie, it felt like there was a lot of weird editing choices, and it was very distracting when it came to the situations that were happening. So one good example I can give is Ethan Hunt is moving through an airport, and he's got to, on foot, go from point A to point B, and he has a mission where he needs to lift something from someone. The moment of this movie, beat by beat, is accompanied by different pieces of music, but then also a lot of the time they take the music out, and I'm a fan of when a movie takes music out for the purpose of making a moment filled with tension. They do a really great job of that in No Country for Old Men. In Oppenheimer, the last movie I talked about, they do a really great job with the Trinity test scene and the lack of music there. It's just a lot of breathing and a lot of visual effects going on, and it's super powerful when it comes to creating tension that way. With this movie, it feels like they wanted that to be that way, but the exclusion of music in certain scenes was really jarring, and it felt like it did the opposite of what they wanted to get out of it. Instead of creating tension, those scenes sort of became almost a little too goofy for me. Like, you could hear all the footsteps, you could hear the breathing, you could hear the sort of like murmurs of the crowd, and the lack of music there was really off-putting. I feel like if they had that music there, it would have made the scene a little more well-rounded, but it just felt very messy to me, and that was something that I had to notice for the movie because it just took me out of it a few times. Another one, of course, is this movie being a part 1 of a part 2. To me, it doesn't feel as grand. It doesn't feel as tongue-in-cheek as the other movies. Like, this movie, weirdly enough, takes itself very seriously, when the previous installments felt like they were a little bit more aware of what kind of movie they were making. You know, it's a very sort of fun, goofy, campy espionage thriller film with a lot of action and a lot of cool stunt work and set pieces, whereas this one has some cool stunt work, has some cool set pieces, but the way that they try to give it weight to try and make it feel more serious than I think it needed to be was also kind of distracting to me. Like, where was that sort of fun that we had with Rogue Nation and with Fallout specifically? Because Fallout, I think, is one of my favorites from the entire franchise. Where was that fun in this movie? And I hope that, you know, when it comes to part 2, when they have bigger and, you know, grander and more compelling scenes to go in it as far as spectacle, I hope they sort of embrace that campiness again, because this one, it just felt like it was a little too heavy-handed when it came to the tone of everything. And like the theme of AI being the villain and the sort of like evil force behind it, you know, maybe they had this screenplay written before the whole advent of the writer's strike and AI going on and the different sort of concerns when it came to AI integrating itself into the art space. Maybe they had that stuff written out before this whole thing became a public concern, but the timing of it just feels like this movie is just really trying to embrace this sort of concept as a villain and use it in a way that feels too on the nose. And I wasn't a huge fan of the way they do that. And when that's sort of the evil force behind everything, it's not like you can really get behind the characters fighting against it, because then at that point it almost becomes like a man versus nature type thing. Like, oh, we have to fight against the machine. I like it when a bad guy in a film franchise has a face and has something that the characters can fight against, and there's a clear goal that they have in mind. And I think that something like this maybe could be compelling, and we'll have to see in a part 2, because it's also just a product of it being a part 1. But for right now, I just wasn't super impressed by that. I'm kind of digging at this movie a lot, but this movie is one that I enjoyed, and I really enjoy the action set pieces, and Tom Cruise doing his own stunts is always compelling to see. You can tell that he's giving it his all, and I do like a lot of the characters and the acting in this film. You know, Rebecca Ferguson, Simon Pegg, Vig Rhames, like that whole cast to me is sort of a perfect formula when it comes to making these movies. Like, sure, you don't really have a Mission Impossible without Tom Cruise, but I like the way that they've built up these characters within the past few movies in this franchise. And I think that keeping that core group together is sort of what makes these movies special to me. I wasn't a huge fan of how they handled one of the characters and the results of everything going on. No spoilers, obviously, but check the movie out yourself, and if you've seen it already, maybe you'll know what I'm talking about. Not going to talk about this one anymore. I think I've pretty much said what I need to say about it. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is a 7 out of 10. It's probably closer to a 6 than it is an 8, but we'll see how Part 2 shapes up, and then maybe that'll influence my rating on this film overall. Well, that was great. We pretty much got through everything for the month of July, so thank you guys for checking this video out. I appreciate it. Hopefully this time the video doesn't cut out and the rest of it is up, so fingers crossed that you get to see my whole face during it. And if that's not what you wanted, well, listen while you're driving then, because really the visual of this is sort of secondary to what I'm saying into the microphone. I'm kind of rambling right now. I'm just going to stop right there. Be sure to check out the podcast. I think you guys would enjoy it, and the previous Film Watch videos are still up, and for the month of August, that'll be up in 2 weeks from now. Hopefully, by the time you see this video, hopefully I get it up in time. Hope you guys have a great day, and I will talk to you guys again some other time. Bye-bye.